Okay, we are live here on Google Plus and on YouTube, and we're going to get started with class. Today's class is Maimonides Principles. We're going to do class 1, which will be focusing on his principles of belief in God. Let's see here. Okay, so everybody should be able to view the broadcast now. If anyone wants to join in, you're welcome to join in. But if you want to send any comments or anything like that, go ahead. And I'm going to be addressing 4 people in the room here with me. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Does everybody have the worksheet I sent out, the syllabus page? Yeah. Okay, great. Right. All right. So let's go over the first 5 principles that Maimonides brings down, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about them, and then we're going to talk about the criticism to them, the adversity that he faced in laying down principles, and then we'll talk about why these are important. So let's go over each one of the first 5 principles, and we'll talk about each one of them individually. So the first one is, I believe with complete faith that the Creator, blessed be his name, is the creator and guide of everything that has been created. He alone has made, does make, and will make all things. And by the way, if you're not sure where to find this, it's in every Siddur, usually at the end of the Shachar service, and you can find it in your ArtScroll Siddur. I don't have the page handy, but it's right after. It is right after the morning prayers. So in the first precept that he lays down is belief that the Creator has created everything, and that nothing else can cause that. And that's actually the first chapter of Yesodi HaTorah in the Mishnah Torah. The Rambam in his book on Jewish law lays down this as a foundation principle. For him, this becomes really important just based on his affiliation with Aristotelian science and the science of the time, but it still becomes very much important for us to understand that God has to be the one who creates and makes all things. In terms of the bigger picture, what Maimonides is really talking about is that specifically in the time period in which the rabbis of the Talmud lived, there was always a challenge to the theory that God made everything. There was challenges at all times as to whether or not God was actually the creator, or if he simply was the artist, which was a common theme in Greek thought. And it wasn't necessarily Aristotelian, but we're not going to talk about Greek thought because I don't want to be here for more than an hour. But basically, suffice it to say that the thought of that time period in which the rabbis of the Talmud lived was that it's possible for the gods simply take existing matter and play with it, and therefore that matter was already existent, and they could use that, and they thought that was okay. So Maimonides expands that to basically say that that God has to have created everything. That time began with God, that all matter began with God. And he develops this more fully in the first 2 chapters of The Guide for the Perplexed. Everyone is welcome to read that. And if you do read a version of The Guide for the Perplexed, you want to take the Shlomo Pines, P-I-N-E-S, translation is the best one. There's another one out there, the Friedlander one, which is not very good. The translation is not very good. And there is the Shlomo Pines one, or Pinas, as he's actually pronounced in Hebrew. It's written as Pines in English, so P-I-N-E-S. He has the most accurate translation of it. If you would very much like to read that. Also, it should be noted that this is actually a common theme amongst a lot of other Torah commentators. So, for example, actually, Maimonides, in the beginning of his commentary on the Torah, Maimonides, remember, lived about a couple hundred years later than Maimonides, and he lives in Barcelona in Spain. He talks about what some people like to call sort of an early Big Bang theory. What he talks about basically is the Greeks had this name for matter called heli, which is spelled in Hebrew Hey Yud Lamed Yud, Eli. I think in English it's spelled the same way, Hyly. This sort of helic matter that was the foundation matter of the universe. The Ramban talks about it. He actually says, but so everybody understands that this material didn't have to exist yet. There could have been one infinitesimal point where it all began and expanded out from there and made the universe from it. Everyone is welcome to look that up in the English translation by Rabbi Dr. Chevelle. And it's not hard to find because it's basically the beginning of the book. So I don't have to give you a page number. Look there. If you want to borrow it and can't find it anywhere, I have a copy in my home. I can scan a copy and let you see it. Wait, didn't hear me say that on live. I cannot scan the new copy. Cannot scan a copy. It's copyrighted material. So number one is basically to understand that God creates everything, including matter and all things. So this has been discussed amongst many Torah commentators. We won't. If anyone has any questions about what else this means, it also means that that everything in the world that is everything that has been in the world was made and created by God. No one else has a hand in this. So you can't. There's no angels. There's nothing else that gets involved in the creation of things. So if there's no questions on that one, we're going to move on to number two. Number two is, if you're looking over here, I believe with complete faith that the Creator, blessed be His name, is one, and that there's no unity in any manner like His, that He alone is our God, who was, is, and will be. So that there's no idea of multiple personalities in God. Now, to find similar parallels in this in rabbinic literature, there's an interesting discussion in the Gemara and Sanhedrin, where a Zoroastrianist basically comes and approaches one of the rabbis and says, how is it that God goes ahead and allows evil to exist in the world? To which the rabbi replies to him, he says, well, you have two gods, one is good and one is bad. And he says, and he said the top half of man is good, the bottom half of man is bad, but yet, the bad guy allows the good guy to pass things through him at all times. Meaning, when you eat something, you eventually excrete it. So they got to be working together somehow. So why would there be two separate performances in one being? So those of you familiar with Zoroastrianism, there's Ahura Mazda. I hope I'm getting their names right. I don't exactly talk about them very often, but these two gods of Zoroastrianism, basically the idea was that good and evil were parallel functions in the world, and that they worked away in parallel to each other, and so therefore the point is that good and evil are experienced through the same creator is the point that the rabbi is making to the Zoroastrianist, and there are plenty of other examples of this as well. When Turnus Rufus, who is the general who comes to destroy the second temple, there's a point where he puts Rabbi Akiva into jail, and he basically says, if your God is so just, why does he allow? If your God is so just, why does he not take care of the poor himself? And he also asks him, like, if your God is so perfect, why does he require you to do the mitzvah of circumcision? And Rabbi Akiva gives him the same answer. He says because he wants us to perform mitzvos. The idea being that somehow contradiction should somehow prove a pantheon of gods or experience of multiple forces in the world that do not cooperate with each other. Most specifically, for people familiar with, in terms of the most antiquated form of idolatry, the experience of Babylonian polytheism is one where the gods are fairly capricious. If you read their works and so on, they don't understand why things happen to them. And therefore, their experience is that the gods must be crazy, and therefore they're always at war and battle with each other for control. And so therefore, all their experiences sort of look at variable interaction between the gods, and you find that in most polytheistic experiences that they're unwilling to say that perhaps everything comes from God, and that we have to look at more than just what is under the surface or what is on the surface, just that we look at these crazy events as not unified. And so therefore the second one is basically see that no, it all comes from God, good and bad, whatever it may be, all comes from him. Any questions on number two? way more fun when we get to the criticism of the principles. Number 3 is, I believe with complete faith that the Creator, blessed be His name, has no body, and that he does not have the properties of living creatures, and that He has no form whatsoever. Okay, all right. So just a little funny anecdote, a story about my Rosh Hashiva, Zichron Livracha, Rabbi Gedalia Einemer, many years ago. Someone told me a very cute story. He was teaching young children, and basically the story went along that I'm thinking this is the right story. Yeah, this is the right story. So basically, the story went along that you want to know, someone wanted to know about the kid was basically had a question about the guys who wrote the Torah. The kid was asking an innocent question. Maybe I'll bring the story up again when we talk about divinity of the Torah and so on and so forth. Talk about the guys who wrote the Torah. And so supposedly one of the other children in the room saw Rabbi Einer's reaction. He said, "What guys? There's no guys. There's no guys. God wrote the Torah. There's no guys involved." So basically the idea of no form, there's no, always remember there's no guys. Okay, that's what this one pretty much means. There's no guys involved. So there's no form, there's no structure. Now anthropomorphism has been dealt with a number of times in the commentaries, and we won't spend a long time talking about Ibn Ezra's theories, but we will point out that for the most part, most commentators believe that there was that the descriptions of God were merely to put God into a format that people understood. An outstretched arm is a symbol of war. Standing upon the mountain, Har Sinai, was not an idea that God actually stood there, but that the idea was that to speak in a language that people could understand his presence being there. So as opposed to using what, let's say, for example, the Aramaic translation uses not one anthropomorphism. It always describes God in non-corporeal forms, whereas the Torah is happy doing that. So the idea being that that in some ways people need to, even though you use anthropomorphic words, the idea is that your understanding should be not that way. There was nothing there. You didn't see any form on the mountain, which is what the Torah itself says. You didn't see anything there, and therefore to understand it that way would be a limiting factor to God. What I will point out over here, interestingly enough, just really quickly, is that the Ravad, on his commentary to the Yesodei Torah, when the Rambam mentions this in his own law code, says that, hey, there's a lot of people who thought that God had a form and so on and so forth. And they were pretty impressive guys too, so why are you calling them heretics? So that's a gloss of the Ravid, Rav Avraham ben David of Pokier, or whatever that name, how you pronounce it, Pokier, Poskier, however you pronounce it. I don't know how you pronounce that word. I just know that's how you write it. Doesn't matter. He's written on the page, and he makes this comment. We'll talk about that more in a minute. That there were some people who believed in anthropomorphisms of God, but it doesn't seem like any evidence of that from any from any Talmudic or Mishnaic literature that people actually believe that God had a form of any kind. So it's really a question of who's he talking about and what were they saying. But we'll come back to that in a moment. Any questions on number 3? Okay, so far there's one God. There's one God who creates everything, that He does everything, and that He has no form. All right, so let's go to number 4 over here. Okay, I believe with complete faith that the Creator, blessed is He, that He is the first and the last. So meaning that that everything that will be and has been always focuses around God. We're not going to focus on this one too much. This is not debated so heavily, but the idea is that God precedes everything and will be there afterwards as well. So that when everything promised about creation happened, it was through His will, and everything that will end up being will also be that way as well. Okay, we're not going to dwell on that one too much. Number 5, I believe with complete faith that the Creator, blessed be He, is the only one to whom it is right to pray, and that is not right to pray to anything besides Him. So what that means is that, and this has actually been a contested issue for hundreds of years since the times of the Rambam. So that means you can only talk to God for things. So whenever you have any, we talked about, we've talked about what prayer looks like. We talked about this. We talked about tefillah, is that when you need something, you're calling out directly to God. You're not calling out to some angel or other force to save you. The rain God will not provide you with rain. Nor will, for example, when we say the tefillah for Geshem, if you look in your Siddur, about the tefillah for rain, about the prayer for rain, it mentions Af Bari, that there is an angel appointed over the rain. We are not praying to them directly, but simply saying that there should be an ability to entreat towards God to provide you with rain. There are some ideas that one can have your prayers heard by angels and then brought before God, but there's no idea of actually seeking any favors from angels. And so that's the point that the Rambam is making, that you cannot ask angels for things. And when we talk about the criticisms in a moment, there were some people, there were some, especially in Ashkenazic literature, from especially the Ashkenazic literature around the Slichot before Rosh Hashanah and during Rosh Hashanah. There is mention of talking and asking favors from angels and so on. So there is what to discuss for that. So there is that to consider. Okay, so those are the 5 principles. Those are the first 5 principles. Does anybody have any questions about the first 5 principles before I sort of go off and start talking about what they are? Okay. All right. So let's talk about. Those are the first 5. The first 5 are all talking about belief in God. Let's talk a little about the origin of these 5 over here. Now we've talked about them. Basically, what's going on is that these 5 are not the actual language of Maimonides. It's a shorthand version. There's a longer version of these that is. These are abridged from his commentary on the 10th chapter of Sanhedrin. It's on the first Mishnah in there. The first Mishnah in there is Kol Yisrael Yeshem Chelek La'olam Haba. All the Jewish people have a share in the world to come, whatever that means. You don't have to worry about that for right now. We have another class on what that means, the world to come. But suffice it to say for now that there's a concept of an ultimate reward for another world to come. And Maimonides felt it was imperative to explain who was going to go ahead and be qualified for this, because the second half of the Mishnah says the following do not get Olam Haba, and it lists a bunch of people, which again we won't get into right now, because then we basically spend our entire time talking about a Mishnah in Sanhedrin, and I want to focus specifically on his principles. So let's just deal with the fact that the first half says that all the Jewish people deserve a portion in the world to come. And the second half talks about those who do not. It talks about categories of people, and then it names certain people by name, such as Yerovam ben Nevat, the first king of the 10 tribes of Israel, had no share in the world to come because he led everybody astray to worship idols. Menashe, the son of Chizkiyahu, also doesn't have a share in the world to come, and so on and so forth. It lists a bunch of people who no longer have a share in the world to come. Jews specifically no longer have shares in the world to come because of various things that they did, being outside of a class of people. But the reason why Maimonides himself feels compelled to have to explain what these principles are was a matter of debate, and we'll use this to go into the quote-unquote criticism section over here. We'll talk a little about what Maimonides himself feels the need to have to do, and then we will talk about the criticisms of it. So Maimonides himself basically says that there's a need to write these principles because we need to establish who is and is not in sort of the pale of the Jewish world. And it does have longer range applications than just who gets ultimate reward and so on and so forth. There is, for example, it does have implications as to who is fit to be a shochet, one who's allowed to do kosher slaughter. The first Mishnah in Chulin deals with who is permitted to do shechita, and then there's some discussion in the Talmud as to what categories are being assumed in the Mishnah. One of them is that someone who is an apostate from Judaism is not fit to do kosher slaughter. So you need to define what an apostate is. What are they not believing in? So they mentioned the Karaites and other such people. What are they doing wrong? So if you don't have categories for what they're doing wrong, you can't exclude people. You have to have categories of exclusion. These things all make legal and make total legal sense. So Maimonides for sure feels compelled to have to explain certain categories. He also feels compelled by it based on a need to sort of explain, based on a need to sort of answer up a lot of questions. As he himself points out, there's 5 categories of people who feel that there's like 5. He gets 5 categories of people who believe there are certain things in Judaism that are more important than anything else. I'm not going to go through his whole chapter on Halek, but it should just be important to know that he wants to point out that his 13 principles are to do sort of 2 purposes. Number one, sort of focus on what are really the most primary belief systems, and not trying to focus on one single aspect. And he's also trying to exclude other types of ideas from. There's certain types of people who their very behavior should preclude them from being in the world to come. He says that the 13 principles are fundamental beliefs, but he says, but you also see in the Talmud that it says that someone who gives people bad nicknames, like if you call somebody fatty all the time, right, to have them share in the world to come. Why are you not? Does that mean this person has not kept any other mitzvahs in their life? No, it just means that such type of people, right? If someone who gives up somebody a bad nickname loses their share in the world to come because they simply are missing the point of their performance of mitzvahs. But it doesn't mean that they are themselves somehow apostating Judaism. So he wants to clarify when, just trying to clarify with these principles, when is the Talmud using hermeneutical hyperbole versus actually trying to say a legal principle. So that's what he seems to say as his reasons for these principles. And so he therefore undertakes a task of, again, he's a young guy when he writes the commentary on the Mishnah, and he writes it for a very broad audience because it's originally written in Arabic so that many people could read it. And the translation that, for example, that I use is a translation of Shmuel ibn Tibbon, written later on with his approval. That basically gains the widest spread and experience because I don't know Arabic and no one else here knows Arabic, and especially Arabic written in Hebrew characters is also kind of hard to read. So I even have a Siddur at home that somebody kindly gave me where the instructions are written in Arabic and Hebrew characters, and I have no idea what's going on. It'd be better if it was written in Yiddish. I would understand it better. But anyway, so the Rambam starts with the first 5 that basically say that if you don't believe in these certain fundamental ideas about God, you're basically outside of the realm and belief system of Jewish practice. I'm not going to dwell too much on the categories mentioned in the Mishnah. Just know that it's important to know that there is a Mishnah, that there is material where the rabbis discuss this, because it's going to be important later on when we go over the critiques. So before we go on, just with the critiques, is there any questions about what I'm talking about? Does everybody seem to get a general idea about what Maimonides is talking about? All right, just real quick review. Maimonides' goal is basically to give us some clarity on what are legal categories that would exclude somebody from receiving the reward in the world to come, and also what precludes them from serving in other Jewish functions, such as being a shofet and a witness for testimony. He wants to establish legal categories that are useful to us. Okay, that's what he says. Okay, so now let's go over.
So they don't have to go through searching through the Talmud, right?
Yes. He says it's not so you don't have to go searching through the Talmud, because he doesn't bring the 13 principles themselves in his in his work, the Mishnah Torah, which is his legal work. He only lists it here on the commentary on the Mishnah. I just got to plug in my computer because the battery's going past it. And he does bring these ideas independently and separately and develops them in different chapters in the legal code, but he doesn't start off with like everybody's got to believe these things. So he doesn't bring it, he doesn't organize it this way anywhere else other than in his commentary on this one Mishnah. But these ideas are all developed further in his legal code. So I didn't want to dwell on it too much, but all these things are all developed further. And we'll develop the idea a little further when we talk about the Abravanel here in a second. So the first wave of criticism against Maimonides comes from Spanish philosophers in the 12th to 15th century. And we're going to look specifically, really briefly, at Hasdai Crescas. And we're going to talk about Yosef Albo. Yosef Albo is also going to be paired with Shimon ben Semach Duran. And we'll also look at Don Yitzhak Abravanel. And what they have to say in terms of their critique of Maimonides and why they say what they say. All right, we're going to look at them really quickly. So the first one, Hasdai Crescas, he wants to limit the principles to 6. So Hasdai Crescas, and again you can look these things up. There's actually a great book if you really want to read. I bring it over here in the 3rd section over here. With Perfect Faith. I made a tiny URL for it because I found it on Google Books. If you don't want to spend $70 to buy With Perfect Faith, that's fine, but you're only going to get little snippets of it because it's a Google Book thing online. But if you buy the book, he develops these things in full. All these ideas are from there. It's written by Rabbi J. David Blythe, and he is, without a doubt, probably one of the most brilliant people I've ever listened to in my entire life. Anyway, I won't talk about him. So Hasdai Crescas basically wants to limit Maimonides' principles to 6. So Hasdai Crescas basically, his biggest critique is there's too much redundancy in these principles. He says we can narrow it down to 6. Okay. So the biggest problem is that why do we have to say that God is unified? God is the creator. God is why do we need so many different things? He limits it to 6 things, and we'll go over them now. He says God's knowledge of everything. So God knows everything. Omnipotence, he sees everything. Providence, he is in charge of everything. Prophecy, which we are not seeing that tonight. We'll talk. Maimonides has 3 or 4 principles talking about prophecy. Free will, that people have the ability to have free will, and Torah's absolute truth. So free will is going to talk, when the Rambam talks about later on reward and punishment, and those things are all met out. Crescas focuses more on the idea that people make choices. He doesn't focus on God's ability to punish, just that people have the ability to choose. And he also points out the Torah's absolute truth, which again, Maimonides breaks up into a few different categories. So what he's saying is that some of these are redundant, need to be contracted a little bit more in order to prove, someone has to believe in all these things in order to accept them, for them to have accepted that once they accept these things, they will therefore be allowed to have a share in the world to come. Going back to the mission again. So Crescas is basically trying to say, Maimonides did a good job starting it off, but really we can narrow it down because there's too much redundancy in it, and his work is not very long. And the Hasdai Crescas's book, you can read it. You can see it online at this link when you look at With Perfect Faith. It's one of the first ones listed. That is Hasdai Crescas. So fast forward a little longer, about 100 years, and you get to our good friends Yosef Albo and Rabbi Shimon ben Semach Duran. They live around the same time, and Shimon ben Semach Duran doesn't have a very long piece about it. I was trying to find the Hebrew on it to show everybody just how short it really was. It's actually a response to somebody who asks him about the principles of Maimonides. I was trying to find it again. I just, for some reason, was having mental block trying to find it. And so I apologize, I don't have it listed here. It's very short, and he basically says, I can narrow down Maimonides' 13 principles. It's like if anyone remembers the show, Name That Tune. I can name the principles in 3 notes, right? So now, and I thought it was fair because they give you some hints with the music anyway, so you can't really name it in 3 notes. It's just that you already know the answer without the music. So it's not Name That Tune. You already know the answer. But anyway, Albo, on the other hand, doesn't have. I'll talk about him in a second. But Shimon ben Semach basically says you can narrow it down. God exists. There was a revelation at Sinai. and we're rewarded for good deeds and punished for bad deeds. That's the main things that come down to. Now, what's really interesting is about Kreskas, Albo, and Duran is that none of them mention one of Maimonides' central ideas is that there has to be a belief also in this. When we get to talking about the world to come, you have to believe in that as well. Maimonides says you got to believe in that there's certain world to come things that you have to believe in as well. That Mashiach will come, that there's a Messiah who will redeem the people and bring them back to the land of Israel, and that there's also resurrection of the dead. Those things are not mentioned in Kreskas or Albo or Duran. They're saying that no, their belief system is specifically almost Duran for sure. And Albo say it all talks about God. And with Kreskas, it's also pretty much all about God. It has nothing to do with the system that that the system itself works for us and then gives us reward. We don't have to talk about that. Now, you can believe. Now, the reason why that's important is when we talk about Albo here in a second is because people want to look at the historical context of it. But right now, I just want to talk about their opinion. So Duran basically says all you need to do is believe in these three things. Once you know these two things work, you don't have to worry about Maimonides' long-winded principles. Forget the three principles and just believe in these three ideas, and everyone's good to go. Yosef Albo, on the other hand, writes a sefer called Ikarim, which is beautiful. It's wonderful prose. It's very poetic. It's 500 pages, and it's gorgeous prose. If everyone wants to take time to read it, I personally have never been through the whole thing, and it's wonderful to read. He talks about it. He also talks about these. So he talks about these three principles. He talks about how the reason why these three principles are so important because they also find expression in Rosh Hashanah. Again, when we talk about Rosh Hashanah, or if you listen to my class online about Rosh Hashanah, I talk about Yosef Albo and how he works it in. That's why these three principles are so important because they find repetition and meaning in the liturgy themselves. Yosef Albo basically, living almost later than all these other gentlemen, has a very beautiful sefer where he talks about how all the different categories all work really nicely, but they all fit into these three smaller categories. So why have such large categories? I can narrow them down to three. And then he basically goes through and explains how all these different ideas all develop. Existence in God means the following. He goes on for 100 pages, right? Revelation means the following. So he has all these big ideas that he develops. It's really long. It's really beautiful. I've never read through it. I'll be honest with you about that. Okay. The other one I want to talk about is Abravanel, because he discusses Kreskas and Albo specifically, and he comes to some very interesting conclusions as to why Maimonides' approach is actually fairly valid. And again, you can actually see a lot of these things at the link I've listed over here if you want to read it. You're not going to see everything we'll talk about with the Abravanel tonight because they only bring chapter 23. The book I'm talking about is Rosh Amanaz, quoted on the link in the book With Perfect Faith. Chapter 23 talks about why Maimonides made sense. What you don't see in there are chapters 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, all the way up to 23. Basically, he goes through the other approaches and says that, yes, you have valid questions on the approach to Maimonides. There is a lot of redundancy. There seems to be issues with these ideas. There seems to be a lot of expansion with how far they go. But I'm just going to focus on chapter 23. One through, the most interesting ones are really 1 through 10, where he talks about Kreskas and Albo. Then he kind of talks about the issues. And then 23 is where he kind of summarizes all up, and that's one you can read in English online, so I'll talk about that one the most. Basically points out that he says anyone who studies the Mishnah we already mentioned, that this idea of that all of Israel has a share in the world to come, and there's some who are excluded. When the Rambam wrote the work, he wrote it in his youth, and he wrote it for people who basically were trying to sort out what their Jewish world was going to look like. And so as a result, he's writing a commentary on the Mishnah to kind of say, all right, so when I'm learning Mishnah, I'm looking for categories. I'm looking for where do things fit in. So, Mishnahs are very, very simple and straightforward. This works, this doesn't work. That works, that doesn't work. This is good, this is not good. This person owes money, that person is exempt from paying money. The Mishnah is very straightforward. And when you get further and deeper into the study of it, you can kind of go, well, the language means this, and if I compare it to this stuff. But even before you get there, you just need to kind of know what is the Mishnah talking about with certain people and certain categories of people being excluded. And so that Rav explains is why you need to have these multiple categories, is because you're trying to understand what the different classes of people are who would be excluded. And the thing that the Rambam cannot do is he cannot say, unlike the other commentators here, Kreskas and Albo and Duran, which he doesn't mention Duran specifically, but he addresses Albo and Kreskas, is that what they are basically doing is seeming to say that there are principles that sit at the top of Jewish belief. And he says that that's not the way that it works. He said if God was trying to set out major categories and then bring sub-branches, like, for example, with the laws of Shabbos, at some point when we talk about this, there are major categories and then there are subcategories underneath it. So if you were going to organize the Torah that way, then when you gave the Ten Commandments, you would have said, okay, most important thing is you believe that there's a God, right? And then the next most important thing is that you believe that there's a revelation in Sinai. Well, the Ten Commandments doesn't say you have to have belief in revelation in Sinai. Why? Well, because, you were there. But it should have said that should have been a point right then and there. Believe in Sinai. The mention of Sinai as a belief, as part of the belief system, isn't mentioned until they're standing at the banks of the River Jordan in the plains of Moab, ready to cross over. And Moshe says to them, and remember standing at Har Sinai. But if that was an integral principle, God should have put that on the tablets, right? I am God. I did everything. And number 2, don't forget that there is a revelation in Sinai. Number 3, you'll be rewarded for all the good things and punished for all the bad things. Now, even though those things are mentioned in the Ten Commandments, they're not listed as primary categories. And you could have had a Mel Brooks moment where basically Moshe drops the other commandments and says, oh, there's three commandments, right? So for those who remember that movie, great. If you don't, I am moving on. So History of the World, Part 1, at the very beginning of the movie. Look for it on Netflix or something. But anyway, the point being that the Rav point is that no one mitzvah is more important than another. So Maimonides doesn't need to look for the most boiled down categories. He needs to tell everybody these are 13 things that if you don't believe in them, that you are basically not following classical Jewish belief system as they've set down in the Talmud. Okay, and that was probably the simplest and best explanation for what the Rambam was trying to do. And anybody who reads his work all the way through, you kind of get that's the feeling that he's getting to. He's saying that people will make too many claims about certain things being most important. Like these things are important because they relate to how you approach reward and punishment in God's system and how you fit into it. It doesn't mean that you are a bad Jew, but what it means is that you are this is a facet of your Judaism that you have to work on, and therefore he puts it into that category. And again, it's actually this type of stuff is actually even more fascinating when you talk about categories of people who are acceptable to do kosher slaughter, to do shechita. This is really awesome to think about because there's some fascinating sugyas, at the beginning of Chulin, of the Masechta that deals with, the beginning of it deals with kosher slaughter, asking a lot of questions, Jews who worship idols, could they do kosher slaughter? Jews who stop believing in the oral Torah, could they do kosher slaughter? Jews who stop, because in that time period when the Talmud was being written and the Mishnah was being collected, these were all issues, and therefore they were dealt with there. And it's much more fascinating in that context. We will not get into it tonight. If someone wants to have, or a group want to have Maseches Chulin Be'iyun, I'd be happy to do that, just not tonight. Okay. Any questions about our good friends, the Spanish philosophers? Okay. And you may be asking yourself, why do we jump from Spanish to modern? The reason is because there's basically no discussion on this topic for hundreds of years. The only thing that happens in between is they write very nice poems like Yigdal. Yigdal is a poem that is sung by pretty much every Ashkenazi congregation on Friday nights. Many people recite it first thing in the morning, every single morning, and it summarizes these principles. Even the ones that I'm quoting for you in Hebrew are also a poetic collection of Maimonides' more expanded principles from his commentary on Sanhedrin. Basically, you get in between, after the critiques, you get a lot of nice poetry written. The only other comments on it are basically some comments made by 19th century scholars, basically saying that, well, you know, these things were kind of debated and they kind of settled on Maimonides' ideas. It's mentioned basically in a responsa of the Chassam Sofer. Chassam Sofer was the chief rabbi of Pressburg, and basically he lived in the 19th century. And long story short, was just kind of asked about, you know, what do Jews believe, and he says, well, everyone pretty much accepted Maimonides' teachings, and that was pretty much it. It wasn't really a cause for discussion. The only other time that belief systems are mentioned is that in the subject of receiving converts to Judaism, Maimonides points out specifically that these central ideas and beliefs, like the rejection of idolatry and God's being central, other principles, are things that are informed of to the convert when they are converting to Judaism. Otherwise, the idea of principles of Judaism isn't really mentioned very much else. And so, therefore, it's mentioned in the Shulchan Aruch and its commentaries, and so it makes its way into the law code. But there's not much touch on it until fairly recently, when people decided it was fun. It was fun to debate things again. So we're going to move on to modern critiques, and several of these are found in the previous link in With Perfect Faith, and others of them are found basically in their own books. I didn't quote them all here, but I'll mention them shortly. So the first modern critique is from Rav Yitzchak Zev Soloveitchik, who was the Brisker Rav. He was the last Rav. He was the last of the Soloveitchik dynasty to have the yeshiva in Brisk in Lithuania. After his time, him and his children moved it to Israel. As a result of the Holocaust, they moved it there. And also, interestingly enough, a good old-fashioned philosopher, Julius Gutman, had the same idea, that the reason for Maimonides' principles was theology as the intellectual connection with God. And this is also something that Rav Yasser Ber Soloveitchik, known as the Rav, the Rosh Yeshiva of Rosh Yeshivas Yitzhak Elchanan, basically Yeshiva University, also developed this idea in Halachic Man, that the reason why Maimonides felt compelled to write 13 principles is because it gave the Jewish people the ability to connect intellectually to God, meaning they had no idea about how to relate to God and what he did and how he interacted with the universe, and they wanted to understand how, they wanted sort of rules and guidelines, right? When I throw something, why does it stop? Well, because we have gravity, we have friction, we have a whole bunch of other things. There are laws of thermodynamics, but they're sort of a theological dynamics. And so therefore, we use these principles as a way in which we can help us contemplate how God interacts with our world and helps give us meaning. That is their opinion. The next interesting one is from Mark Shapiro and Nathan Lopez, Rabbi Nathan Lopez Cardozo. Mark Shapiro is not a rabbi. Rabbi Nathan Lopez Cardozo is a rabbi, and Cardozo has his own academy. So they basically believe. So their critique on the Rambam is that the Rambam actually did a huge disservice to the Jewish people by lining things up into principles, because Shapiro's approach is that there was a lot of debate and discussion, and as I mentioned to you before, there were some people who felt that there were even normal ways to anthropomorphize God, and so therefore, according to Shapiro, you basically shouldn't be so heavily invested in Maimonides' principles other than to study it as a guide for belief. But there's no real reason to feel, completely married to them, because otherwise you'd be calling many other early commentators heretics for things that they had said. That is Mark Shapiro's approach. He has a book on it, on the Maimonidean principles. Everyone is welcome to check out. And there was a number of articles and writings. He also has an original article from 1989, I believe. That was the basis for that book. It took him 11 years to write it. The book was published in 2007. So that's Mark Shapiro. And Cardozo takes a separate approach. Cardozo takes the approach that dogma is something that is foreign to Judaism, that the Rambam was very heavily married to Greek thought and Greek systematics, and since the Rambam himself wanted to be dogmatic, he made Judaism dogmatic, and therefore what was once as he himself puts it, what was once a beautiful sort of amorphous system of belief and connection for the Rambam became systematized, because the Rambam liked systemization. But really, you don't need to do that in order to approach God. That is Cardozo's opinion. Again, the interesting thing about it, Shapiro takes the approach of, so the scholarly approach. Not very agree with the Rambam because no one felt, he goes through systems of thought, that we have angels in the liturgy, we have people, who said that God has anthropomorphic forms. Shapiro is sort of very looking at it in a very scholarly way. Cardozo looks at it by sort of looking at the overall theme of it, and he's one of the first to start basically blaming Maimonides for having lived in his time period and saying, no, you were a very Greek thinker and you wanted us to think like Greeks, and so therefore you wrote up dogmatic principles. The only person to really say that the Rambam was wrong is Menachem Kellner, and everyone's welcome to read about his book about that. That the Rambam is at odds with rabbinic thought, and that the Maimonides basically sort of ignores what is said in many places throughout the Talmud, which I find that to be by far the sharpest comment on it. And you can read the link that allows you to read the book online. And so it's interesting to see the critiques on it. But anybody if you actually read Maimonides' comments and his if you read first of all his comments to Chelek, and then if you read through his work on these topics, if you work through the Mishnah Torah on it in Yesodei Torah, which is actually available at Chabad's website in English, if you really want to take an in-depth study into it, you may not see so many things at odds. And one of the critiques on Kellner's thing is that basically, if you're taking, as Maimonides, as I was mentioning before, takes a legalistic look at the Mishnah says these are categories of people who are excluded from the Olam Haba. And the reason why that's important is because if you look at mnemonically how Sanhedrin is structured, so Sanhedrin deals with basically court system. What does a court look like? Who can testify in these courts? How do you set up a court? And then how do you punish people? And what are their punishments? And what are they punished for? And there's 4 types of punishments. And when they mete it out. And after going through all of that, it's like, oh, and by the way, there's another set of punishments that don't involve a court, but involve the heavenly court. So, and then this chapter, after having discussed all the different types of punishments met out by the court, then we're in a section here called that basically where God meets out punishments. It says the following people merit the world to come, and the following do not. And then it continues on. So it says that all Jews merit the world to come, including the people who had already suffered death penalty as a result of committing other crimes and sins. But they all have a share in the world to come, except for the following people. And then it goes through and says, oh, and by the way, in a city where most of the city has committed itself to idolatry, those people also have a share in the world to come. So it's very thematic. So the Rambam is taking a very legalistic look at it. So that point is actually made very well by Rabbi J. David Blythe with Perfect Faith, but seems to actually flow from Maimonides' words himself. And also that point is somewhat made by the Abravanel and Rosh Hashanah. So with that, I want to conclude tonight, if there's no questions on the modern critiques, because no one's saying anything, so everyone clearly likes listening to me talk. So I'm going to keep talking. So I'm going to end it off tonight with the importance of uniformity in belief system. And we're going to talk about specifically one person in that Mishnah in Chelek who basically puts an end to this uniformity in belief system. Is one of the people listed in that Mishnah as not having a share in the world to come, which is Yeravam ben Nevat. So uniformity in the belief system is an imperative. I list a couple of reasons over here, and I point out there's a centrality of Mishkan, Mikdash, place of worship. There is a lot of effort placed into. There's a lot of ink spilled in every Sefer Torah to write about the building of the Mishkan and that it moved and went with the Jewish people everywhere. Clearly, it takes on a very central place. It was situated in the middle. And it's the resting place of God's presence, and therefore takes a very central role in Jewish practice. That centrality is then transferred. The Mishkan remains until its days at Shiloh, when it is then destroyed, and then in the times of David and Solomon, in the earliest days of the Davidic dynasty, the Mikdash, the base of the Mikdash, the essential house of prayer, is established, a place where all the Jews would come together to pray. And in fact, is even described as the place where all people would look forward to pray. And so, therefore, the uniformity of a belief system that God is the source of everything is central and imperative to this belief system. Having multiple places to pray, not to play. Yeah, you can play whatever you want to, but praying should be done in one place. But actually, to offer sacrifices is an imperative. Even the law codes of Judaism talk about that. All external altars, which were permitted up until the establishment of the Beis Hamikdash, after its establishment, are no longer allowed to be used because the Mikdash takes central form. It takes central form. All sacrifices are brought there. The focus is all there. And when that is destroyed, both after the first and second temple, places of worship are established to maintain that uniformity and centrality. That's why there was established blessings and formats and words were all set down for the words of the actual tefillah, which we talked about before. I keep pushing my previous class like it makes a difference. But anyway, but the idea that the system of prayer is uniform, that everybody can share in it, is imperative. So also the centrality of the legal, moral, and ethical system is also an imperative. People need to share a similar legal, moral, and ethical system. If they don't, it's going to corrupt the entire system. They're not going to be unified. They're not going to take the same approach. And that's why I want to conclude with why the 10 tribes of Israel are no more. Yeravam ben Nevat is listed. I'm just giving this as one example. I didn't want this class to go on for 4 hours, but Yeravam ben Nevat is one of the leaders of the Jewish people in the days of Rechavam. Rechavam is the king of Judah. He's the son of Solomon. He heavily taxes the people. He builds lots of stuff. People are miserable. And Achia Hashiloni, Achila of Shiloh, is the prophet at the time and gives Yeravam permission to break away from Rechavam. That Rechavam's heavy taxation system and getting people to come to work for him was just bad. It was bad, needed to change. But Yeravam becomes engrossed in his power grab, and he realizes that in order for him to stay in control, the people won't turn back to Jerusalem. He establishes a new worship system. No more Kohanim and Leviim. He's got his new caste of people who are going to provide worship services. They put 2 golden calves on the way to Jerusalem. They established their own worship service, and he knew exactly what he was doing. He was going to create his own independent kingdom and his own manner of worship. And for that, if you look in the Book of Kings, you can read the whole story of it about basically how God curses him and his whole family, and that everything from him would basically be wiped off the face of the earth because he has destroyed what was meant to be built. So the idea of having uniformity in the belief system is to keep everybody together, focusing on the centrality of the whole system. So tonight we dealt with specifically about the belief in God, and that's why I want to end off with this importance of uniformity. Is that even though there are critiques to the system and set up by Maimonides, Maimonides' system works, meaning there needs to be central beliefs, that people need to rally around something. There needs to be a central cause to everything. And knowing that they are believing in certain things will help keep them, motivate them together, because keeping the people together is really the main focus of the Torah and its mitzvahs. And as the Abravanel himself points out, no one mitzvah is supposed to be more valuable than another one, just that these are guiding principles as part of the overall system as a whole, that the principles themselves, one doesn't stand higher than the other, but that they help to bring sort of a cohesiveness to the entire system. With that, I'm going to wrap up the broadcast on air. Thank you, everyone, for coming out tonight, and I will send you an email about the broadcast in 2 weeks.